no matter where you've been. So let's do it again. Listen up and let the sun shine in. We've got soul training. Time to practice what you preach. Ooh, yeah. Yes, we do. We've got soul training.
Hope everybody is doing really, really well. Alan Jones here with Big Show Joe and Daniel Dano Gaines from Tanzania. But we also have a very special guest, Sasha/Alex from Ukraine is with us. And probably, I'm hoping that you'll be listening to this podcast like really soon. But what's happening in the world, we know, is that Ukraine is... Sasha, would you say, I meant to ask you earlier, Ukraine or the Ukraine?
Ukraine.
Ukraine. I heard some people say the Ukraine, but Ukraine is how you're the expert. Ukraine has been invaded and attacked and at war with Russia. And so we have been given the opportunity here in South Central Kentucky to have I'm going to struggle with this, Sasha or Alex. I'm going to go with Sasha. Sasha, and I'll let you kind of explain a little more in a few minutes, as our guest, who is from Ukraine and still has family in Ukraine. He's also a brother in Christ from Ukraine, but he also lives in the U.S. and is super, super intelligent, has a terminal degree in differential equations. You have your PhD, correct?
That's right.
And I'll let you talk about yourself. But that's the introduction as we a little different than usual because we, as Joe said, we try to start off sometimes with something a little funny, but we want to protect and respect Sasha's time. But we also want to highlight the seriousness of all of our podcasts, but especially this one. And so that's our setting the tone or creating the climate for this podcast. But as I said, Ukraine has been invaded or is at war with Russia, and that began about February the 23rd or 24th of 2022, and today is March 31st, so a little more than 5 weeks roughly. Now, you're the mathematician. You could correct me on my numbers, but about 5 weeks. And I've always told every generation has its war, and it seems like this is my second one, actually third one, between Vietnam, Iraq, or the Gulf War, rather, and actually I guess my fourth one, Iraq, and then Ukraine and Russia. So this is it is very sad to see, and it's very concerning to see the news reports of all news outlets across the world. But Sasha is here in the U.S. not only working with his job and his full-time job, but he's also taking a short break to raise money for supplies for his home, his community, his church, and also for the forces there in Ukraine. So I hope I've covered kind of the purpose of Sasha's visit in the U.S. and being with us. So, Sasha, I'm going to just ask just real quick, if you would just kind of tell us about, you said you were 15, or you told me on the ride-up that you came to the U.S. when you were 15. And just tell us, the world, the people who are listening, about who Sasha is. Why are you here, and what would like? How can we help you?
Yeah, tell your story to us.
Okay, well, thanks for the opportunity to share it. I would like to use every single opportunity to tell the Christians and the world about Ukraine and about what's going on there. So I'm a professor of mathematics. I currently work in Richmond, Virginia, at Virginia Commonwealth University. I grew up in a small town, relatively small town of Kremenchuk in central Ukraine. And starting from 90, 91, 92, Kremenchuk got the group of missionaries from the Church of Christ who came to establish the church. My mom was one of the few English teachers who agreed to help them because there were not so many teachers who would be willing to work with Americans. It's unbelievable. The story of my mom was unbelievable when the Americans came to her school and asked, we need someone to help us translate. Most of the teachers refused. They were afraid to work. And my mom said, I'm not. I'm open. I'm willing to help. And the other teachers asked, like, well, they will force you to do something. They are not here to teach Christ. This is just their cover. But my mom said, no, I trust these people. And she's been working with American teachers since 91 up until now. And that's how I got introduced to the Church of Christ. And eventually I got baptized at the age of, I believe, 15 in Kremenchuk. In 2001, I was one of the winners of the exchange program. I could come to the United States for a year to finish the high school, which I did in Nashville, Tennessee. Got my high school degree from the US and from Ukraine. And at that time, I made my mind that I want to do mathematics. I came to Kiev because I did want to study mathematics. I wanted to do it in Kiev University. That was the dream of my childhood, to be living and studying mathematics in Kiev. And I got accepted, and I studied for 5 or 6 years in Taras Shevchenko Kiev National University, Department of Mechanics and Mathematics, and I got master's from there. And around that time, I applied for my grad school. I applied various places in the world, and I got accepted at Pennsylvania State University, where I got my degree and I got my PhD in mathematics 5 years later. I worked for 3 years at Purdue University as a visiting assistant professor, at New York University as a visiting assistant professor, and here I am at Virginia Commonwealth University as a tenure-track assistant professor.
Wow, that's an extensive resume. I struggle, if I'm doing division, if the number gets out past like 4, so I could not speak the mathematical language. So I'm thankful for people like you, not only mathematically, but also spiritually, and the contributions you've made to humanity already.
Well, if you look at the papers that I'm writing, you hardly see any numbers. You hardly see any addition or multiplication of these arithmetic operations. Probably the only numbers you would see are the page numbers.
Wow, I could handle that.
He's so good at math, he is beyond numbers.
Wow.
Now, there are people who do numbers. There is actually a branch of mathematics called number theory. That's not what I'm doing.
Yeah, I think that's what I did, was a theory of math. But I want to know specifically, Sasha, about the church in Ukraine, because right now we see these images on television of the destruction and things, and I don't know, but it seems to be that the church is strong over there, and so it hurts me and folks like me to see those images, knowing that is my Christian family over there suffering at this time. It's not just, I don't know those people personally, but I feel a connection to them because we share Christ. And so I want to know about the church in Ukraine.
Well, let me just give a brief overview of who are these people who came right now to Ukrainian land. The invaders who came from Russia, they didn't come to Ukraine for certain economic reasons, or they didn't come to capture some resources, any of that. The invaders came to capture our values. And the first invasion in the modern history of Ukraine by the Russians happened in 2014, when the Russians occupied southern Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea, as well as they occupied certain counties in eastern Ukraine in Donetsk and Lugansk regions. Donetsk, before the invasion of 2014, was the main Christian center in Ukraine. There were a number, probably more than 10 churches in this city. It's the 5th largest city in Ukraine. There was a Sunset Publishing House. All of the properties of Christian churches was taken away by the Russian invaders immediately. And I would like to suggest to look up Vice News, a video by Simon Ostrovsky on the religious war in Ukraine. This is a 20-minute video that is specifically devoted to the attitude of the invaders of 2014 to the church, where the invaders, being interviewed by this American journalist, explicitly say that the Western Christians are not welcome on their territory. So they've not only taken away their properties and used them as a training camps for their fighters, but they also persecuted Christians, and they were basically banning them from gathering. So we went back straight to the period of Christian persecution, in as barbaric as it was 2,000 years ago. We could not believe that. Sorry?
How did you find ways to worship in secret?
So we're talking about Donetsk, 2014. Some of the Christians left, and including one of the elders in Kremenchuk Church of Christ, used to be an elder in Donetsk who had to leave his town and his church in 2014. Another elder from Donetsk Church of Christ went to the city of Mariupol, and most of Christians from Donetsk ended up in Mariupol, which was the city in the same district, in the same state as Donetsk, but it was free. And you probably saw Mariupol in the news. Mariupol right now is one huge tragedy. The city of 500,000 people is completely wiped out and leveled and disappeared from the face of the earth.
Wow.
So there is no way that the Christians can survive in Donetsk. The Christians had to leave, but luckily, the rest of the territory of Ukraine, up until February 23rd, was free and open for Christians to gather, unlike in Russia, which was becoming more and more restrictive towards any religion but the Orthodoxy. But the territories which Russia occupied are way worse than Russia itself in terms of the persecution of religion.
So I don't understand, why are they persecuting Christians there? What do they not like about Christianity? Do they feel it's necessary to go to war over?
They feel that that anything but their so-called Russian Orthodox Christianity is the influence of the Western world, or the influence of the evil, what the West is. I think it's a big mistake to think that this is a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a war between Russia and the civilized world. And as soon as Ukraine wanted to associate itself with a civilized world, that's when Russian president made the decision to go after it, to go after the Western influence in what he thinks is his land. So this Christianity, any form of Christianity rather than Russian Orthodoxy, is the example of evil in their eyes.
Right. So I have, and Daniel and Alan, I've got a bunch of questions. If you guys have questions, just stop me. Y'all the ones that get paid to talk, right?
No, I don't. The only question...
Wait, you guys are getting paid?
Right.
I'm thinking, Joe, the only question I have, and I think you've answered, my son, I kind of, knowing going into our podcast that you would be here, that I reached out to different people and said, what would you like for me to ask? And my son just simply said, and you've kind of touched on that, how has the church been impacted? And obviously, firsthand persecution, having freedom to worship has been taken, having to worship in secret, which is something that we do not know anything, or I don't know anything about. And
that was one of my questions too, is along the same lines. Is the church, are they still meeting even while there's shelling and tanks and soldiers walking the streets, are they able to meet?
Well, I can speak for the hometown where my mom is. The hometown Kremenchuk, as of today, has not been affected directly by the war. The Church of Christ in Kremenchuk hosted about 20 families from the Kharkov region and from Sumy region, so the ones that were wiped out by the Russian artillery in the recent days. These families are currently sleeping on benches in Kremenchuk Church of Christ. The college building, which was built in Kremenchuk for the purpose of training preachers, also accepted some families. There's also a little area where they are living right now. So if we are talking about 2014 to early this year, the Church of Kremenchuk technically benefited from the occupation of Donetsk, because we got a lot of faithful Christians who, well, unfortunately had to leave their homes, and some of them found their new church in Kremenchuk, including one of our elders in Kremenchuk Church of Christ, a very nice man, used to be an elder in Donetsk Church of Christ.
My brother wanted to know, how does a Christian stay faithful and encouraged during a trial like this? How can you wake up rejoicing in our God when you're losing those around you?
Oh, I think the faith becomes way more stronger with all the hardships. The people tend to forget about God when everything is fine, when they have abundance of money, abundance of food, abundance of everything. That's where majority of people will forget whom they should owe for that. At the moment of the crucial moments like what we have right now, made people think and turn their souls to God way, way more than under any other circumstances. And on top of that, I want to say that one opens the Bible, one can find a lot of prophecies, lots of analogies with what's going on right now in Ukraine to what's happening even in the Old Testament, especially in the Old Testament.
There's been wars forever.
There were wars described in the Old Testament. And people ask me well, do people realize why they're going through this? And I have an answer, well, there is a plan. If people are going through this, if God made Ukraine go through this, He has a plan. Ukraine is learning a lesson. Ukraine had problems with identity earlier throughout its history. Those problems were artificially, again, made by Russians because Russians killed so many Ukrainians and populated the territory of Ukraine with Russians before that at some point that territory started to question, well, are we really Ukrainians, or maybe we are Russians, or maybe we don't care who we are, maybe it doesn't really matter if there's Russia here or Ukraine. And these people had to learn the lesson that you value your country only once you are about to lose it. And that, unfortunately, there is probably no other way to restore this identity. So what Russia did, what Putin did, he definitely restored the identity, but at the tremendous cost of lives.
Yeah.
There are many other analogs in the Bible. Like I mentioned Isaiah 37, verse 36, mentions 185,000 soldiers. Well, that's exactly how many soldiers Putin prepared to take over Ukraine.
That's interesting.
And 185,000 soldiers were killed by the angel. That wasn't the entire Assyrian army, but once that amount was killed, the invasion of Judea by Assyria stopped. I have a strong belief that the same prophecy will work in Ukraine, and once the 185,000 soldiers that Putin sent to Ukraine will be killed by Ukrainian angels, the war will stop.
Well, it seems to be at this point, this episode will be released in 2 weeks from tomorrow. And so there's 2 weeks of unknown. But at this point, it seems to be that Ukraine is making some headway and pushing the Russians back.
Ukraine made it impossible. Everyone, including myself, including U.S. intelligence, and most importantly, including the aggressor, believe that the Ukrainian army will hold for at most 3 days if Russia launches all of its war machine against it. We are living through the end of the 5th or the 6th week of the war, and Russia hasn't proceeded even like 10% of what it originally wanted.
Right. And not only that, they look a little inept and confused. But Daniel, I'm going to throw it to you. You've been awful quiet. To those listening, this is our most multicultural episode. Daniel, we have Sasha from Ukraine here in studio. Daniel is currently, it's like midnight 30 over there where he's at in Tanzania. But Daniel, I'm going to throw it to you to ask Sasha a question if you have some.
Yeah, I think everybody has been tremendously inspired by the way the Ukrainians have fought back and defended their country. It's like you mentioned, surpassed everyone's expectations and has really been impactful on the international stage. You made an interesting statement a moment ago in saying that you don't really appreciate your country until you're until you're threatened with losing it or something to that effect. And I think in many regards, that's also true of our religious liberty and our faith as well. You've already talked some about it, but can you maybe address more how faith has helped you, your family, those that you're aware of in dealing with this crisis?
Well, I would say I'll start with the following proverb, that if you lost your money, you didn't lose anything. If you lost your health, you lost half. But if you lost your faith, you lost everything. Faith is the one that keeps Ukraine going. It's faith in God, faith in our victory, faith in justice, all of this combined. Faith that we are the good and we are fighting with the evil. We are fighting with the as pure evil as it can be in the 21st century. And this faith is why Ukraine is still standing. So I would like to share some stories of how incredible Ukrainian resistance is, and you wouldn't find these stories in the news. So one of them is the story of my mom, whom when the war started, I was here in Richmond, and I really wanted to get her out as quick as possible because I did not believe that Ukraine will last that long and that Kremenchuk will not be occupied within 3 days. But she said, no, I don't want to go anywhere. She started going around the town collecting bottles from the recycle bins so that she could get them to the territorial defense units who would later make Molotov cocktails to greet the invaders once they come to Kremenchuk. Then my mom joined the group of volunteers who were cooking the food for the soldiers, for the refugees. So she said, not everyone can leave. Someone has to stay and keep the country going.
Wow. That's really something. And, just maybe you can even share with our listener just seconds before we began recording, you got on your phone an air raid warning. And I know probably for most of our listeners, we can't even relate to the tension that must constantly be there to know that at any minute you can be getting these warnings that there's a real threat to life for people that you love and know and places that you value. Can you talk about what it's like to have that constant heightened awareness and how you deal with it?
Well, I went through various stages. My emotions went through absolutely some levels which I never thought I could even go through. It was a despair. First 3 days, it was a despair. But starting from the day number 3 and up until now, I'm getting more and more pride, hope, and anger combined. And I'm hopeful. I am confident that Ukraine will win. I'm very proud to be part of that nation. And of course, just some stories that I hear that come from Ukraine are absolutely incredible. I would like to share another story. It's an anecdote. It's a joke. It's even better than a joke. It was told by my advisor, a professor who has a house 5 miles north of Hostomel, the area which was taken by the Russians on the first day of the war. And his house is in a very small community, which is just a suburban community, has a little supermarket at the edge of the forest, and there is a pretty decent-sized wood right next to it. So when the Russians came, they were afraid at first to go into the town, so they were hiding their equipment in the woods right next to that community. And the owner of that supermarket, once he realized that that this town is surrounded by the Russians and the Russians would come any moment and rob the store, told to whoever stayed that you can go and take whatever you want in the store, get all the food away before the Russians came and got it. So the people came there and stocked up on their food. And there were 2 drunk guys who showed up there and said, well, we're getting the vodkas and cigarettes. And they got the vodka bottles, and they were drunk. They had a little bit more of those. And then they said, now we are ready to go fight. And the owner said, well, guys, it's a bad idea. Guys, you shouldn't be, just go sleep. No, we are going to the woods and we'll fight with just the bottles in their hands. And they went to the woods. And it was in the morning, and in the evening, they're coming back. But they didn't walk. They are driving a big Russian truck. They've stolen a Russian military truck which had a grenade launcher in it, which had some grenades, which had a night vision devices. And they parked it right in front of the store and said, that was a good trip. Good trip to the woods. And no one could believe how can they do that. But they had no fear, and they captured the truck. Overnight, someone took the battery off the truck, so in the morning the truck wouldn't even start. And unfortunately, in the evening, the Russians flew the drone and discovered where the truck was. The village was surrounded anyway, so while they wanted to give it to Ukrainian army, they couldn't. So the Russians came out of the woods with a tow truck and pulled it back. You would not read these news stories in the news.
No.
And you would not make these stories up. It's just those stories are better than anything that anyone can make up. But it shows how strong there is a will of Ukrainians to fight. What I see in the news is the stories of Ukrainian farmers who would do the same, would go to find the positions where Russians are hiding, and while Russians are sleeping, or if they left some of their equipment, they'll go and hook up the tractor to the tank, put the tank into the neutral, and pull the tank to Ukrainian, and pull the tank towards Ukrainian positions. And they have taken over a dozen of tanks that way.
Wow. Well, our time is coming. I wish we could stay here all night listening to you, because it brings part of the war here into our forefront. But unfortunately, our time is more or less over. But before we end, I did want to ask you, I know that you've had an idea of things you can do to help. And I want to know how our audience, what they can do to help you. And I'll tell you, if they want to contact us, soultrainingpodcast@gmail.com is our email address. But Sasha, tell a little bit about your efforts before we wrap this up.
Okay, so when the war started, I really, really wanted to be there, to be with my family and to be with my people, to help them fight it. But it wasn't so easy to get to Ukraine, especially at the first days of the war. And then when I started to get in touch with the people whom I know who are fighting, some mathematicians, they started to tell me that, well, we are in territorial defense units and we are short on many supplies. There are many volunteers who want to help, but there are very limited supplies of body armor, night vision, drones, not to mention like other things that are necessary to fight, which is the job of the government to provide. So I realized that, well, if I go there, I am not trained. It may take a while for me to get trained to be useful. Maybe I can be useful here to save some lives, for example, by providing the body armor. I've seen many videos of Ukrainian territorial defense people heroically stopping Russian tanks and being killed simply because they were unprotected. So I start looking into what can we get to get the body armors to the heroes, specifically to the mathematicians, my friends who are fighting. And while it's easier to get body armor in the US, it's a bit challenging to get the export license. It's still doable, and some lawyers are working on it right now. We are about to get one. But in the meantime, it will still take a while for the body armor to arrive from the US to Ukraine. So I found volunteers, friends of my friends in Germany who are willing to purchase the body armor and drive it to Ukraine, drive it under shelling to Kiev. Well, Germany is relatively close to Ukraine, and it's a day trip from the German border to the front line in Ukraine. And so I'm trying to collect as much money to help these people purchase the body armor and some other necessary supplies, which they will send to Ukrainian defenders and hopefully save lives. And my next goal, of course, would be to help the wounded soldiers, to help the saving lives and of our heroes in any way I can.
Well, those are definitely worthwhile efforts. Is there anything also that we can do specifically to support and encourage the church over there?
I'm in touch with my mom, who is in touch with the church regularly. As of now, the church has enough resources to be helping the refugees who are arriving in Kremenchuk, but I'm absolutely sure that as time goes on, the church in Ukraine will need help as well, especially if the flow of refugees will be at that rate or even higher if the war is not stopped. So the church is doing all they can to help. They are working on more humanitarian aspects. They are working with the refugees. They're working with the evacuated orphanages, because some of the orphanages that were evacuated from the war zone, the kids spent over a week in the basement without any food or water. And they were like grabbing these bottles of water as if that was the most precious thing they ever had in their life when they arrived in Kremenchuk. And they are still better off than some kids on the occupied territories, which were being raped and abused by the invaders. So there's so much that the role of the church is incredible, like incredibly increased right now in Kremenchuk and all over in Ukraine.
Well, they are certainly in our prayers, as is the whole country. And I hope that you'll, as opportunities to help present themselves, and we want to know about it because we're interested in that. Sasha, thank you very much for your time and for making time to be with us. This has been very enlightening. I've appreciated it, and I'm sure our audience has as well.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to share my feelings, and thank you for the interest. I think it's our joint effort. It will take the joint effort of the entire world to win the evil, and with the world being united, the evil has no chance.
I really appreciate your perspective and your thoughts. You've said some very very poignant things this evening. So thank you again, and thank you, Alan. Big show. And we, as always, want to thank the elders at the South Green Street Church of Christ for making soul training possible. And we especially want to thank you, our dear listener, for letting us be a part of your day today. And if you have some feedback, we would love to know, maybe what persecutions have you faced? How these things impacted you? What's been your reaction to hearing some of the things that have happened in the Ukraine? We'd like to hear all about it. So you can email us and let us know. Or if you have another show idea or question, we'd like to hear about that as well. So until next time, keep soul training.
Got soul training. Time to practice what you preach. Ooh, yeah. Yes, we do. We've got soul training.
To learn more, you can email us at soultrainingpodcast@gmail.com, or you can write to us, P.O. Box 503, Glasgow, Kentucky, 42142. That's Soul Training.